stuff or whatever.
Sure.
And it so there wasn't quite that level of attention paid in the days that Tekashi was not there. The people who showed up were, some media, of course, but primarily a lot of friends and family
Sure.
of the defendants. This was very different, right? The guy at the center of the trial is a world famous centimillionaire, public figure for as long as almost anyone can remember.
Mm.
And so everything was based around him, right?
Mm.
He had a lot of supporters there. It was sometimes hard to tell in the actual courtroom because, you have to be quiet or you'll get thrown out.
Right.
But, definitely you could tell at certain times just based on sort of the vibes or chatter you hear in the hallways or whatever. But I would say, most of the support you could probably see more clearly in one of the overflow courtrooms, which is
Sure.
where they put everyone who didn't make it into the actual courtroom. And those were, the marshals did their best, but I was there in the beginning for the first 3 or 4 days. But from what I heard afterwards, it was often a little looser and people could talk or exclaim or sort of show their feelings a bit more than in the actual courtroom where, Sean Combs is right there.
What, as a hip hop fan and as somebody who has been so tapped into the culture, you mentioned before you have a different perspective in terms of how you might relate to the subjects and the subject matter compared to other reporters. So I'm curious, you're there to do a job and you're a professional reporter, but from the perspective of a hip hop fan or the perspective of all the memories that I know you have associated with music from this time and a lot of the people, who might have been involved, what was that like for you? What was going through your head as you sort of watched this unfold? And I'm curious to know.
Well, for one thing, I think, the only person who recognized 88 Keys when he showed up as a former guest of the Cypher.
Shout out.
Yeah, he was a guest of Christian Combs. That's what he said. And he was sitting with the family, so I certainly have no reason to disbelieve that. He showed up a couple times. So that's the sort of light version, right? Is like, when he showed up or when, people like Larry Jackson got mentioned in passing. He had nothing to do with any any of the charges, to be clear. His name came up in passing. Or actually a better example would be when oh my gosh, I'm completely blanking on the name, but there were a few sort of hip hop adjacent executives whose name, or artists whose name came up in passing. They were at a dinner where this happened or a trip where that happened, or they were present when this person met that person, right? So not everyone would catch those things. So that's the sort of surface level, right?
Right.
In a deeper sense, uh it's sort of almost unbelievable, right? If you think about Sean Combs and his history, right? I have, as you know, interviewed over the years many people who worked with him. I had never, prior to reporting on this, met him. I still wouldn't say that I've met or talked to him particularly, other than making eye contact across a crowded courtroom.
Right.
But I talked to a lot of people who had worked with him in his sort of artistic heyday, right?
Sure.
Members of the Hitmen and artists and things like this. One thing I'll say about this trial is it focused on conduct and alleged conduct from 2007 or 2009 until last year.
Mm.
which was, I think, I think fair to say past his artistic prime, albeit certainly not past the prime of his fame, right?
Sure.
So, there was stuff about like, oh, he's in the studio and this and that. He did seem to spend a lot of time in the recording studio, but like this was the era of his career where he was running Revolt, he was doing liquor deals, he was sort of more of a personality who you remembered used to do music maybe than a guy who was sort of at the center of hip hop. So like in that sense, like the trial was a little, it wasn't like it
He
didn't
wasn't he
sort of
wasn't recounting, like, the making
yeah,
of, like, the first Lox album, and, like, this happened while he was, in the
right.
studio with Biggie. This was a different era, a different chapter
Exactly.
for him.
Yes, this was a very different era. I mean, interestingly, in the grand scheme of time, not that much later, right?
Right.
2009 is not that much later than 1997 or whatever, but it was an
Sure.
entirely different, in the span of a human life or whatever. But it was
Well,
an
yeah.
entirely different era for him culturally.
I was saying this to somebody else the other day about, tracking years in relation to music, and like 4 years in general, everything is relative. 4 years could be seen as a small blip or a fairly substantial amount of time, but if you really think about 4 years through the lens of high school, who you are before high school versus after, like, can really make a huge difference. So even saying like, yeah, 2009 was that, not too far removed from 2005, which I think was, I want to say early 2000s, was probably like the Ben Stiller music video and Bad Boys for Life and all of that. But that is a significant amount of time, and certainly is a different chapter for him
Mhm.
in terms of his life story.
Yeah,
Um,
this was like the sort of early one of the witnesses testified, oh, when she started working for him, he was running, he was in A Raisin in the Sun and he was running the
wow, I forgot.
marathon and he was doing the vote or die business. Or I don't think the marathon, I think she mentioned the marathon, but yeah, he was doing the vote or die and he was starting on Broadway. And it was sort of that, that celebrity era of Diddy more so than you know, sort of a lot of the music stuff.
There's such a strange dichotomy and like a poetic irony for somebody like him who, first of all, just taking cheap shots, was the head of a company called Bad Boy, right? But to so many people, this is someone who, depending on who you ask and depending on your perspective, either represents the pinnacle of entrepreneurship and black excellence, and the face of what success in America is
That's
for
that's what his
for
lawyers say.
right, right.
Yeah.
Or, and I'm really speaking just, we'll disregard any of the actual, behavior and alleged activity, but just on a musical level, for so many hip hop fans, he's either that and like the face of like, good times and excellence and party and just thriving, or he's like the antichrist to so
Mhm.
many hip hop heads in terms of what they would, as aesthetically attribute to be good hip hop music,
Well,
or
this was always super interesting for me, right? Like, if you think I always got the impression when talking to, you know, underground artists of the late 90s and early 2000s, of which I've, interviewed many over the years, they were set up as sort of in opposition to, you know, the shiny suit. This is when sort of the whole concept of underground hip hop was more or less born, right?
right,
As being sort of a separate part of the
the haves and the
yeah.
have-nots. Yeah,
And so they were sort of the anti, shiny suit, bad boy commercial, sampling a song everyone knows type thing. I I don't think, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but in my experience, many of the artists didn't really see themselves that
right.
way as like stark opposites to what was happening. They were all at the same parties, especially in cities like New York, where, in the late 90s, the scene was still comparatively small. They all knew each other. And, Diddy would show up at lyricist lounge events and all of this kind of thing. So, like, I certainly there are artists in that sphere who do hate him and view him as the, the antithesis of everything they hold dear, but that's not nearly, in my experience, that has not been nearly as common as, it was for the fans, let's say.
Yeah, no, it's definitely more of a fan heavy perspective. I mean, what in your mind were sort of the turning points or significant milestones in the 7 weeks that you were there? Are there any moments that stand out to you as being like particularly fraught or significant or just meaningful to you?
Look, if I were to look back at the 4 or 5 notebooks I'm staring at here, uh, I could turn to any page and be like, "Holy shit." Like, more crazy stuff happened in that trial and more crazy stuff, I heard more insane things. Like, I've probably forgotten, you know,
You've been
40
desensitized.
insane things,
Yeah.
that happened, right? Because there was so much. It's more when I think about it, right? It's more moments, right? It's more hearing witnesses recount what they said happened, right? Hearing about the woman who he used to work with, who testified under the name Mia,
Hmm.
hearing her talk about the time she said he sexually assaulted her so many times that after a while, it became a blur and she could recall some incidents only in flashes.
Hmm.
Um, Seeing Cassie have to, there was this one period when Cassie was testifying where, so much of the time I'm writing down stuff, right? You have to write by longhand, no electronics allowed, right?
Hmm.
So I'm writing stuff down by longhand the whole time as quickly as I can, trying to get as many direct quotes as I can fit without my hand cramping up or falling too far behind in what they're saying so I lose something. So,
Right.
that takes a lot of concentration. There was this moment in Cassie talking, and she was on the stand for 4 days in total. There was this moment about halfway through where stuff slowed down and she was just shown photos
Hmm.
of escorts who were involved in these freak offs. And it was, oh, I knew that one by this name, you know, I saw him in this city and this city. That was the template, right? Name you knew them by, where you had jurisdictions or not cities or countries in some cases where you had freak offs with them. And so just by the nature of that, there's sort of less to write down. So, things sort of slowed down. And that just seeing the photo after photo after photo, not by any means a complete list, but just they went through it and it took probably 10 full minutes for
Hmm.
them to get through the lists of all the men they had there. And that was just extremely affecting given how she described these things as like, she didn't want to do them, she said, and they lasted for days at a time, and she was on so many drugs and had to do them even with UTIs and
Hmm.
all of this stuff, right? So seeing when things slowed down enough that you could get a sense of the scope that this really did happen hundreds of times in cities all over the country and indeed in places all over the world. That, for some reason, I think because of the change of tempo, almost to use a musical term, that really sticks out to me as a moment I won't soon forget.
I mean, I can't ask you to speak on behalf of any of the people involved, so really, can only go to you for your own personal perspective. But what was it like for you? How are you able to deal with hearing day in and day out about some truly disturbing and graphic, happenings and allegations and actions? Well, like, are you just coming home totally zonked, or do you like sort of leave it? Like, are you able to sort of compartmentalize your brain and your soul really from what you're dealing with in the courtroom to then how you're moving and operating when you get home, which I'm sure also was littered by, if you went on social media, you're probably seeing, you know pictures and all of these reports
Hmm.
that other people are doing about this trial.
Yeah. So great question. I don't know if I have a great answer, which is to say, during the period it's going on, um, I'm by the time I get home, right, you just to give listeners an idea, right, I'll get there, spend all day writing stuff down, you know, get occasionally running out during a break to call my editors or frantically type something on Slack about what happened. Um, Afterwards, I would often have to make a short video, here's the big stuff that happened in the trial, and or write a summary of what happened. Um, and then, you know, by the time all that happened and I was on the train home, I'd get home, have enough time to eat something, watch about 23 minutes of television, and then go to sleep so that I could get up at 5 a.m. to start the cycle. This is a very long way of saying there was not a ton of processing time during the actual trial,
Right.
right? You hear stuff, you're taking it in, but a part of your brain is sort of focused on like, oh, did I get the exact words right? Or like,
Right.
oh, what's the summary going to be? Or like, what's the takeaway today? Right? There's just sort of like a lot of this that is you doing your job. That said, amongst the reporters, there were plenty of jokes that weren't jokes about how we need to go to group therapy after this.
Right.
Right? There was everyone was aware that you were hearing very heavy things. Um the few the few days after it ended and I could finally slow down and take a nap and it was tough. I felt like there was a period of a couple days where it was hard to get stuff out of my mind,
Mm.
right? That eventually passed, and but I I think it wasn't until after it was over that really, some of the gravity of what I saw and experienced and heard people talk about really had a chance to set in. Um, Having other reporters around really helped in the sense of like other people went through this.
Yeah.
July 4th, 2 days after the trial, I had a one of the reporters, just got a few of us together at a small bar in Chinatown, and we drank and did karaoke and, talked about what we'd seen, and that, so stuff like that helped a little bit, having some camaraderie with people who sort of you went through all this together.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, when you're moving at such a breakneck pace and you just are focused on what is ultimately a very challenging task of documenting and reporting, and again, taking concern to the accuracy of what you're doing, there's not a lot of room to really look at the bigger picture and just sort of zoom out and consider, as you said, the gravity of what was all being
Mhm.
discussed. But
Yeah, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but I will say that it's, one thing that has happened in the aftermath is like, I have had a chance to take stuff in and think about like, well, what sort of were the bigger forces at play here? Like, why did things turn out the way they did? What does that say about uh society or laws or
the fact that he was found not
things like that?
guilty
The fact that
of
he was found not guilty of,
racketeering,
of the most serious charges of
yeah, and
include
the
of
sex trafficking
racketeering and sex
charges,
trafficking, yes.
yeah.
And, I am lucky to be in a position where if I'm wondering about something, I can I have an excuse to call up someone who knows more than me and talk to them. So, there is some writing, some interviews sort of percolating around some of these larger issues that will pop up pretty soon.
Got it. Well, I mean, not to jump the lead, and if you want to just defer to talking about that when the time is right for you to address these things, but what do you like for someone who, not all of us are legal experts, and
Mhm.
honestly, most of us are not legal experts. The law is very complicated, so for many of us, it has sort of felt like a very strange result for many of us who felt that this was sort of clear cut. And
Mhm.
while there were some charges, he was found guilty on 2 counts of, transportation,
Mhm.
for the purposes of prostitution.
Yep.
He, like you said, he dodged the major ones. Like, how
Mhm.
does that happen? What is your take on that? Why, like, what were the circumstances that led to the outcome that we all saw when this was announced after the jury, finished their deliberation?
So the short answer is we won't know until one of the jurors who was there, talks about the deliberations, which they may never do. So far, the main juror who's been talking has been one of the alternates.
Mm.
And, I know as much as he did. I was there too, like I had a notepad too. So
Right.
I'm not super interested in the alternates take. Um, you know,
Shawn Setaro, no love for alternates. You heard
yeah,
it here
shout
first.
out to George or whatever his name is. I don't know. I have not paid a ton of attention. Um, but I will say this about the verdict. The racketeering charge was very complicated. Uh, you had to have 12 people agree that there was that on two things. One, that there was a criminal conspiracy of which, Sean Combs was the head, but also it had other parts. And second, that conspiracy committed at least two crimes out of this long list of crimes, right?
Hmm.
So normally with racketeering, people think of the mob, or more recently, like the Takashi case, they think of street gangs. Um, in street gangs, people have titles, right? You are a 1-star general or a 4-star general or a whatever. Like you have distinct titles. That's not the kind of organization that the jury was presented with. They were presented with, you know, uh, this guy at the top, and he had, some loyal lieutenants who were security guards, and he had a chief of staff, but she wasn't there the whole time. She was only there part of the time.
Mm.
And, she never testified, so we never really heard from her. Uh, the jury apparently thought, I guess, seems to have thought that was a tough sell. I don't know. That would be my guess. As for the sex trafficking, um, a lot of the defense hung on messages, right? On texts that Cassie and Jane Doe, a woman who testified under the name Jane Doe, who was the other alleged victim,
Mm.
messages they sent uh, to Combs and that Combs sent to them. And in some of those messages, they seemed enthusiastic about these freak offs, these hotel nights. They seemed to express, not only desire for Combs, who was their romantic partner and who they both said they loved, but, seemed to sometimes suggest having freak offs or talk about how they enjoyed them, or, sometimes arrange for them to happen. Um, now, uh, interactions between people in a relationship, any relationship, are very complicated and not always surface level.
Sure.
Uh, And when you add in an abusive relationship, and even his lawyers admitted that, he was violent towards Cassie and that there was an incident of violence with Jane, although, his lawyers are adamant that that was self-defense because she was violent first.
Mm.
But let's stick to Cassie for a second. Uh, in a violent relationship, right, things become even more complicated. And, the government's argument was, she may appear to be saying, let's have a freak off tonight, but she maybe, in fact, is her realizing, like, oh, every time I talk to him and he says, what do you want to do tonight? No matter what I do, it always ends this way. So let me just cut the conversation short rather than being bullied into it for the 80th time.
Right.
Right. Um, you can read those conversations if you want to that way. I've looked at, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of pages of them. They all make sense that way. I think his lawyers would argue they also make sense literally if you read literally the words on the page. Uh, that may have been a reach for the jury, right? To when presented with messages that say I want to do X, uh, maybe it was a bridge too far to convince 12 people that no, it didn't actually mean that. It meant I am agreeing to do X because I know it'll end up at that point anyway.
Mm.
Or I'm agreeing to do X because the last time I didn't want to do X, there was violence, or I'm agreeing to do X because the person who asked me to do X is paying for my house. Um,
Right.
yeah. So I think,
Yeesh.
that maybe it was tough to convince 12 people that those nuances were reflected in these conversations rather than just literally the words on the page.
Well said, well put. So, I mean, I guess besides the introduction and the implementation to the unironic use of the term freak offs in general conversation, and even in hearing you say it in this conversation, I'm like, this is kind of weird that we're talking about it in that way, but it's
I
just
mean,
become
that's how, that sorry to interrupt, but that's what with in his and Cassie's relationship, that's what they called them, both of them.
no, I understand that.
Yeah.
It's just been interesting to see that sort of enter the nomenclature as everyone reporting on it.
Right.
It's just it's entered the lexicon.
Yes.
But beyond that, I mean, what do you think? We don't know what's going to happen. We're going to see what happens, how long he'll be sentenced. I think there's a maximum prison sentence of 20 years.
That
Um,
is that is correct. I would say that is technically possible, but unlikely. I'm happy to go into as much detail about that as you or your listeners are willing
oh,
to hear.
please, please. I mean, yeah. What can you tell us about that? That's not what I was going to ask about, but we can take a little pit stop here.
Yeah, so sidebar about the sentencing. It happens in early October, so we'll know for sure then. But I wrote a long piece about this that you can find on complex.com breaking this down. Uh, but basically, with with federal cases, when you're sentenced, there's a suggested amount of time. Basically, the law says, hey, you know what, we recommend the judge sentence you to between this many months and this many months. That's based on a couple factors. It's kind of complicated, but basically that range the recommended sentence is, depending on who you believe and how you interpret the statutes and all this stuff, somewhere in the range of a little less than 2 years to a little less than 5 years, right?
Got it.
That's sort of the it could be anywhere in that range. His team is saying, oh, if you read the law, it's, between, I think, 21 and 24 months. The government is saying, oh, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 months. Uh, you know, the judge, may decide one or the other or something completely different, sort of TBD. But
Yeah.
that's the general range we're talking about. It is, according to experts I've talked to, it's unlikely that he will go below whatever he decides the recommended range is.
Hmm.
That's rarely done. If he goes above, it may be complicated. It may set up appeals issues. It may, like, you sort of have to have a really good reason for deviating from these guidelines.
Got it.
So all of the experts I've talked to have suggested that the judge will probably end up sentencing him to some range of time between this 20-ish months and this like 50-ish months. Somewhere in the middle of that range is what the experts I've talked to have suggested. Now, that doesn't mean he'll serve that much, because by that point he'll
Right.
already have served 12 months. That'll be counted against it. And with federal sentences, you serve roughly 85% of the time you're sentenced to.
Hmm.
So, back of the envelope math, if he chooses if the judge lands somewhere in the middle of those two numbers, he could wind up serving 2-ish additional years in prison.
Right.
Again, that's all the caveats in the world. I'm not saying that's where it's going to end up, but that is a according to experts I've talked to, that's like a plausible place it could end up of, you know, 2-ish years, maybe slightly less, maybe slightly more of additional prison time. There's
So
also, I mean, there's a possibility he sends to time served and walks out the door. So it could be anywhere between 0 and 20 years, but, realistically, it might be in that 2 years ish range.
So beyond the actual sentencing, what do you think is the larger implication on what this means for his career, and for, to really zoom out, and this is a difficult thing. I'm not looking to you to give the answer, more so just your opinion and to have a conversation with you. What do you think this means for hip hop, for his role in hip hop, and how we sort of all reconcile this? This is somebody who's been, you know, intertwined with so many classic songs, classic artists, moments, milestones, everything that we've talked about of what he represented, whether you're talking about from his greatest champions to his, most bitter detractors, which we acknowledged are probably fans and not Raucous Records signees. But
Right.
what's your sort of take? Like you've spent a lot of time thinking about this and watching
Mhm.
this, and clearly you're somebody. I'm more interested to hear what you have to say about this than any other court reporter who now wants to, project what this means for hip hop and for his career.
Well, I appreciate that. Look, it's I think the time period thing I was talking about a minute ago plays into this a little bit. In that, what the Sean Combs scene in this trial, the guy who you know had to have his toothpaste tube turned the right way before he could enter a bathroom, and you know had to uh have every had to have four assistants all the time, and uh you know had employees work allegedly had employees work like 3 days in a row without sleep and all this stuff, even before you get into what is alleged as far as the freak offs with escorts that the people who did them say they were forced or defrauded or coerced into doing.
Hmm.
um all of that happened, you know after this, you know mid late 90s era, right? After Big, after the locks, after the sort of shiny suit era. um you know and so maybe there's a world where people can listen to that music and it's sort of not tainted by
Hmm.
what he's accused of, possibly.
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, also the volume of songs he is associated with is far greater than songs under his own name or even songs where he's the primary rapper, right?
Right.
So that's also a weird side of it, is like, you know, a lot of songs he's associated with, he may not even rap on, right?
Right.
Or so, it's a Mace song, or it's a Lock song or whatever. Um, so, we'll see how it plays out. I think there may be people who are surprised when they, you know, put on a big song and maybe like, oh, I wasn't expecting to hear these ad libs. I forgot about this, right? And
Right.
but I don't know if it's going to be quite as public a conversation as, say, around R. Kelly, where it was like, does radio play his song? Do you play his song at the party? Yes. Do DJs play his song? Yes. No.
Right.
Um,
I mean,
you know,
luckily we
be
live in a time where it's easier than ever to use AI to strip vocals off of songs, and I could, maybe that'll be it'll harken back to the days when people were
Oh, I'm
selling
sure people are
CDRs.
already working on the, Diddy-less version of Life After Death or whatever. I would be surprised if that hasn't been done.
Yeah.
Um, so, I don't know. It's tough. One thing I have thought about a lot is, we now know what Sean Combs was like, more or less, from 2009 to 2024, and even taking out the stuff he was acquitted of, he did drugs a lot. He had a lot of sex, or watched a lot of sex involving a lot of escorts. Um, he, you know, went into, his lawyers would argue, not broke into, because the door was not locked, Kid Cudi's house when they had a dispute over uh, being involved with the same woman. Um, it, it I often wonder sort of if this is how he was acting then, what was he acting like before?
Hmm.
At when he had perhaps maybe less money, fewer resources, but more cultural cachet, right?
I mean, I guess you would argue that he probably would not have the bandwidth to do this type of behavior.
Mhm.
Or are you saying if he was less in the spotlight, was he doing crazier stuff
I
because he
I'm
wasn't under scrutiny?
I'm saying perhaps when he had maybe more cool, even if less money,
Hmm.
we'll never know sort of the full scope of what that period was actually like. And it might have been scary. We don't know.
Right. I just realized that you could subtitle this episode Sean and Sean talking about Sean. Um, which
Yes,
made
very, very weird to hear my name in the courtroom a ton over those 2 months, by the way. I will say that somehow in my head, I convinced myself that because it was spelled different, it didn't count. And so it didn't feel quite as weird.
got
I'm
it.
not saying that makes any sense,
I mean,
but
phonetically, it makes no sense, but I guess if you feel that there's any sort of like shared projected flame that could be cast, yes, the fact that you guys spell each other's names differently clearly absolves you for any of the alleged
right.
crimes that Sean Combs committed. I can tell you that
Right.
now. I'm not a legal expert, but I feel confident
No,
about this.
I just mean I didn't even feel for some reason I didn't even feel like like, oh, that's my name when they said it a bunch, which again
The,
that makes no sense. But
there wasn't
I
any instance where you stood up and you're like, Your Honor, are you talking to me? Is this about
right,
me?
right,
Me?
right.
Um, Sean, I'd love to know now that you're done with this crazy chapter.
Hmm.
For now, I don't know what else will follow. What are you looking forward to? Do you have anything coming up or on the sort of horizon of what you're excited about that you can share or talk about?
Sure. To be a little more concrete about what we were talking about before, uh, I do have a piece that may be out by the time this comes out. I hope, where I talk to someone who is an expert uh, and has worked for a long time in the nonprofit world around issues of sex trafficking, of sort of anti trafficking, sort of trying to get to the root of like what he Sean Combs was found not guilty of sex trafficking. To be clear, he did
Hmm.
not do that, but like what exactly is sex trafficking, and what does it mean that he was found not guilty of it? What do And essentially digging into like what do people think of when they hear this term, and what does it really mean? And those are wildly different things that
Right,
also may have played a part in sort of what the jury thinks. Like what sex trafficking is not taken, right? It's not it's not your father's coming to rescue from you from a stranger. Often it's your father who's doing it. It's
but I
not your
mean, ostensibly, wouldn't these definitions be reviewed with the jury before, during,
they
and
were
after the trial?
they were. I'm not saying the jury didn't understand this, right? I'm not saying the jury was read the law. The jury did hear testimony from a psychologist who talked about the concept of coercive control, which is very important to trafficking, although they, for technical reasons, weren't allowed to use that term, but the they described it, right? Uh, and they talked about trauma response and all these things that you know play into these issues. Uh, so the jury was exposed to it. That said, um, you know, the sort of stranger danger aspect of trafficking is like pretty deeply embedded in pop culture, right?
Right.
Um, and so,
You're saying
you can
there's influence that runs deeper than what could be addressed in a courtroom if we were to sort of remedy and better illustrate what these things are. It wouldn't lay perhaps a foundational bias so that people walking in, even after they're getting it explained to them, they're like, yeah, but that's not sex trafficking, you know?
right, right. That's when a stranger comes and locks you in a basement or whatever the
Right.
fuck. So yeah, yeah. So I, I that that dichotomy between is in the popular culture hearing that term and what it actually is, which is both a lot more regular and a lot more awful in some ways. Uh, you know, I am talking to someone to sort of help me suss that out, right? Uh, I don't know if it will lead anywhere beyond this interview
Right.
that I did that hopefully should be coming out on Complex very shortly after we speak. But I don't know. It's something that I've been trying to sort of muddle through and become educated about and sort of try to get a grip on, I would say. So not very happy stuff, but I think being seeing, I mean, maybe this is part of sort of the aftermath of this trial, right? Hearing so much testimony from people who said, I didn't want to do this, and yet I ended up doing it again and again and again.
Right.
Kind of like, well, what are the mechanisms that make something like that happen, that get someone to a point where they could say that? And again, to be clear, you know, the jury decided Sean Combs did not coerce these women into doing this.
Right.
Um, but it's hard to hear someone talk about that and sort of come out of it the other side unchanged.
Right. All right. So we'll be on the lookout for the Complex article. Anything else that you want to plug or let people know before we wrap things up?
Whew. I'm sure I will regret not saying anything as soon as we hang up. I will say, on a personal level, even some of my volunteer time has been in the legal realm. I've been very involved with an organization called Court Watch NYC that attends criminal arraignments to sort of try to watch judges and see what they're up to and make sure they don't give people huge bails for, stealing a stick of gum from CVS or whatever.
Right.
The folks at Court Watch, I have did let basically zero of it during the trial. As you might imagine, I didn't
You
want
were
to go down
busy.
the street to a different courthouse after spending all day at another one. But they do great work, and I'm happy to sort of be getting back on board with them. And of course, doing what I can uh, to try to stop this awful genocide in Palestine that's happening.
Right.
Right, I have been again over the past 20 months or whatever it is, heavily involved with Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been uh, active in that, and trying to I'm trying to do what I can on that side of things as well.
Amazing.
So
Well,
not yeah. So sorry to be super serious and not like, hey, I got a record coming out or whatever. But
right. I'm doing my young adult novel and, my
exactly
stand-up comedy album. No,
right,
I mean this is all
right.
important stuff. This is all good stuff, and again, I can't sing your praises enough. Just as a credible voice of integrity, a very gifted writer, and
Thank you, Sean.
I like talking to people that I do inherently believe are significantly well voiced, well spoken, properly voiced, smarter than me, quite honestly. I like to, I like to think that you're the smarter Sean on this call, and
Well,
certainly amongst the three Seans that were discussed or referenced today. So
I want to take a minute also just to thank you for the kind words about the cipher. And like now that I'm a few years removed from it ending, it really means a lot to hear, folks like you. Every time I run into Dylan Green, who does Real Notes,
yeah,
uh, obviously the Nate of the Dad Pod Rap Pod has been very, just seeing like people say, hey, this show, was an inspiration or an influence or whatever, like really means a lot. And
yeah,
hearing what you said at the beginning was very, very meaningful. Like Josh and I put into a lot into that show for a long time. And it's hard to see the impact. We knew it had, X number of thousand listeners every episode, but beyond that, it was sort of hard to gauge, and it's been really wonderful in the past years to see shows come out, not just that I think are influenced by Decipher, but that are sometimes edited by the guy who used to edit Decipher. Shout out to Rob,
including this
right?
one. Yes, shout out to
Right.
Rob.
Shout out to Rob.
You guys are perhaps it's the curse of the pioneer of maybe being too early, and even if you're not too early, it can always be a gamble or roll of the dice as to how the numbers shape up. But perhaps you guys are like the Velvet Underground of hip hop podcasts.
I'll take it. I'll take
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Not every, maybe not the highest numbers, but the right people were
Right.
listening and fell in love and were inspired. So
Everyone who listened to us started a podcast.
Which honestly is not saying much at this point, because I think at this point, anyone who's heard any podcast ever has now started a podcast. But you guys influenced the right ones, if I can count myself in such company.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Shawn. Appreciate you, and we'll have you back. Maybe you'll do something happy in the future,
Yes,
and we can have
that
you
would be
talk
great.
about.
I would love that. I would love that.